Welcome. This is Dr. Ray Umphrey. And today we're going to take a look at the letter of James. This is a letter of James, the brother of Jesus, written to Christians, Jewish Christians who have been dispersed throughout different regions. And he gives them some practical instruction about seeking wisdom and living out their faith. So let's dive right in and take a look at some introductory issues. There's some debate about who the author is among some scholars. But the evidence seems to favor that this is actually James, the brother of Jesus, the half-brother of Jesus. This is in accordance with the early church testimony. And this same half-brother of Jesus was also the leader of the Jerusalem church. We see him functioning prominently in the book of Acts. The book of James could be our earliest New Testament writing. Scholars date it to around 45 AD. If it is indeed that early, it's probably our earliest writing. But since James was so central in Jerusalem, and we see in the book of Acts that so many Christians were dispersed from Jerusalem because of persecution, yet the apostles remained there in Jerusalem, it's very likely that James is writing to dispersed Jews who had fled to other regions, and he's writing from Jerusalem. And this letter perhaps was a cyclical or a circular letter meant to go to different people in different places, addressing similar concerns. Some important themes you see in this letter. Number one is wisdom. So that's actually a pretty huge theme. The word wisdom is only mentioned twice in the letter. However, the rest of the letter is very similar to what we see in Proverbs. Other wisdom literature uses quite a lot of wisdom rhetorical conventions. And so it seems that James is casting his letter in the mold of wisdom, that to live rightly in this world is to live wisely. He also talks about faith and works, that you can't just talk about your faith, but you have to have a faith that actually works and produces fruit. James talks about the nature of God, particularly the nature of God in that God gives good things. He doesn't give bad things. And then, of course, wealth and poverty are a major part of James. He builds a lot of his instruction around the idea of showing partiality to the rich versus ministering to the poor. And then we see prayer. Prayer sort of opens and closes the letter, because at the beginning of the letter you have this call to ask God for wisdom. And if you ask without doubting, you'll receive. But when you go to the end of the book, you see that James talks about praying for healing and praying for restoration and confession of sin. So a few things that are unique from a literary point of view. James contains the highest frequency of imperatives of any book in the New Testament. The letter contains around 55 imperative verbs. And while there are longer books that contain more imperatives, James is the densest and has the highest frequency of them. So it's a very practical, applicational book. There's a lot of similarity in James' teaching and the teaching of Jesus. And of course, James, being the half-brother of Jesus, would have had close proximity to his teaching. There's a lot of material that seems to resonate with the Sermon on the Mount. There's a lot of similarities to Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 through 7. However, what's interesting is James' letter only includes 2 specific references to Jesus, although he's making use of much of Jesus' teaching. I've already mentioned that wisdom is a huge theme in James, but wisdom factors in that James presents the 2 ways of living in the world. And that's a very common theme in wisdom literature. You can live like the fool, you can live like the wise man. Think about the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus contrasts the higher righteousness of God with the lower righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. And Jesus concludes the Sermon on the Mount with the 2 builders, one built on the sand, one built on the rock. I think the letter actually casts these 2 ways, even though it speaks of them in different ways, as the wisdom from above and the wisdom from earth. And you can see that you can kind of categorize the positive things that James commands or exhorts us to do and the negative things that he warns us against. As you look at the structure of James, I think there's 3 main sections to the body. And of course, you have the introductory remark in verse 1, but then in chapters 1 through 3, you have the call to true wisdom and faith. And then you'll notice that that's kind of bracketed because there are 2 mentions of wisdom. The word wisdom is used there at the beginning of chapter 1 and it's used again at the end of chapter 3. So it kind of brackets this part of the letter. And then you have counsel for living wisely in this world. And so James addresses many different situations and kind of the heart orientation to the world around you. And then James closes with a brief final section that deals with those who are suffering, those who are sick, and those who are sinning. And he offers comfort to those people. So you can see kind of how the structure of James unfolds, and that's how we will map our way through this letter. So let's go ahead and begin with the first verse, which introduces the letter. And James introduces himself, though he is the half-brother of Jesus, he introduces himself as a servant or a slave of Jesus. And James says he's not just a slave of Jesus, he's a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. This that connects God and Jesus. And is he a slave of God or is he a slave of Jesus? Well, from a Trinitarian position, we don't see a conflict there. He's a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. This is the first of two and only two references to Jesus in the entire letter. And then he's writing to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. And that word dispersion calls to mind Old Testament history when Israel was defeated and dispersed by the Assyrians, the northern kingdom in 722 BC, the southern kingdom in 586 BC by the Babylonians. And they were taken to other nations and they were dispersed. And so James is writing to these Jewish Christians and he's calling them the dispersion. James continues and he opens up by talking about trials and wisdom. And he tells them to count it all joy when they encounter these trials. He says trials actually work to make you complete. But if you'll notice the catchword there, lacking, you see that perseverance in trials results in you being complete without lacking anything. But in verse 5, notice how he connects the next section or the next thought. If any of you, however, lacks wisdom. So James is talking about not lacking anything. At the same time, he says, but if you do lack wisdom, ask of God. So he kind of transitions into this theme of prayer and wisdom. And he says, because God will give to you generously there, which can mean unwaveringly or without hesitation. Well, it's important to note because in the next few verses, James is going to talk about the unstable person who doubts. They ask and they're doubting. James goes on and he talks about the lowly and the rich. And he says, let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation and let the rich boast in his humiliation. He's basically showing that riches are futile. And if you put your trust in riches, you're like grass. And he says you're going to die and pass away. And the background of this, if we understand that these Jewish Christians have been dispersed and gone to other areas, well, they left their homes, they left their trade, they left their livelihood, many of them probably taking jobs as migrant workers. So you probably have some people who, because of their faith, have fled and embraced maybe a life of poverty because they're working maybe in some job that is not paying very well. Then James concludes this section on wisdom and trials with a beatitude. And a beatitude, sometimes called a macarism, is a very common rhetorical device, literary device used in Jewish literature. It's used in the Old Testament, in the Psalms. It's used by Jesus, of course, in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus actually gives some other beatitudes other than just those in the sermon. But we see that James says, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. So contrasting the rich man who will come to nothing, you have the man who endures trials who will receive the crown of life. So James is trying to show us it's better to embrace your trials and suffer well than it is to seek to be rich and comforted in this life. So James now moves on and he talks about the idea of temptation. And he uses the Greek word perasmos, which he's used in verse 2. The word perasmos can mean testing or trial or temptation. Now we know theologically there's a difference in being tempted to sin or going through a trial. And James makes that distinction here. Temptation, which leads to death, does not come from God. Trials can be blessed because they work in us this completeness and perfection. And he says in verse 18 that the good gifts, God gives good gifts that come to us. And he specifically mentions the new birth. And so he says in verse 18, of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. So what James is saying here is, as you're going through these trials and maybe even experiencing temptation, you're asking God for wisdom. Know that God will give you wisdom, but God gives those things and they're good gifts, and he only gives good gifts, and he doesn't give temptation. He doesn't send temptation. James now moves on and he talks about um, being a hearer or being a doer of the word. And he opens up by talking about sins of speech. Receive the implanted word, he says, and be doers of the word and not hearers only. Then James goes on and he talks about this guy who's not able to bridle his tongue. And he says, if anyone thinks he's religious and does not bridle his tongue but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. And then he says, true religion visits the orphans and widows and keeps oneself holy and unstained from the world. So James says, beware sins of speech, be a doer of the word, and also beware being a talker only, and not being someone who engages in good works. In chapter 2, James moves on and he talks about partiality and love. And he kind of talks about the idea of showing partiality to the rich. He talks about the foolishness of that. He says it's the worldly rich who are oppressing you. So when they come into your gatherings, don't show preference to them out of partiality, but he calls them to minister to those who are poor. And he talks about the fact that God has chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith. But notice in verse 1, he mentions Jesus. This is the second and final mention, explicit mention of Jesus in this letter. And he says, my brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. And this mention of Jesus actually anticipates several allusions or maybe even loose quotations of things that Jesus has said. And many of them show up even in the Sermon on the Mount. Again, James is using that sermon, I think, quite freely. He moves on now and he talks about faith and works. Notice that when he talks about faith and works, he's still talking about the poor, how we relate to those who don't have food or have necessary clothing. But he says basically that faith without works is dead. And he says, what good is it if a person says they have faith but they don't have works? And he says faith without works is dead. And so faith must have works. Now, some have taken this saying of James and pitted it against Paul's teaching of justification by faith without works. We're saved by grace, not works. But I think if you pay attention, number one, to what James is saying, and then if you compare it, number two, to what Paul actually says, I don't think there's that much difference between them. Number one, James does not teach that faith does not save. He teaches that a specific kind of faith does not save. So James says if someone says he has faith, so we're talking about someone who is saying they have faith, not someone who necessarily has true faith. So if someone is a talker, and then he says, can that faith save him? That phrase, that faith, in Greek, there's an article there before the word faith. And that article points back to the specific kind of faith he's described. He's not saying, can faith in general save him? He's saying, can this kind of faith that's only talking, can that sort of faith save a man? So we have to be careful to notice that James is not saying that faith does not save. He's saying that a dead faith does not save. And if you compare this to what Paul teaches, you find out there's not that much difference between them. Dr. Rob Plummer, in his commentary on James, actually shows us from Galatians that Paul says a similar thing. When Paul says, in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, but only faith working through love. And that phrase, faith working through love, is not that far away from what James is talking about when he talks about faith that works, loves your neighbor, and ministers to the poor. When James continues, he actually says this faith that does not have works is the faith of demons. He says, because demons believe and tremble. You believe that God is one. He says the demons also believe that. So he uses demons as an example of dead faith. So dead faith is demonic faith. But then he shows what living faith looks like, and he uses the examples of Abraham and Rahab, who their faith actually moved them to action. In chapter 3, he talks about the tongue, discussion about talking. And we've had a lot of discussion about sins of speech and just empty words. And James opens this by saying, not many of you should desire to be teachers, And he says, because you'll be judged with a stricter judgment. And he sort of builds this case, this very pessimistic view of speech and the tongue. He uses the analogy of a bit in the mouth of a horse. He uses the analogy of rudders which guide ships and a small flame starting a forest fire and taming animals, just to show how unruly the tongue is. He says, if the tongue is this unruly and we are so prone to sin with the tongue, we need to be sobered if we engage in the teaching ministry. And James uses a specific phrase here to talk about the tongue, and he says it's set on fire of hell. And he uses the Greek word Gehenna, which comes from a Hebrew word. It's a Hebrew loan word. And what's interesting is this word Gehenna is a favorite word of Jesus to talk about hell, but it only occurs here in James outside of the Gospels. Again, this is another connection showing us the close connection between James and his half-brother, Jesus. And his words here about how, a grapevine can't produce figs, neither can a fig tree bear olives. It's reminiscent of Jesus' words about the good tree and the bad tree. And it's also reminiscent of so many proverbs which deal with sins of speech. And then we're coming to the close of this first section. And remember, we began with someone who lacks wisdom and they need to ask God to give them wisdom. And this first section closes with James talking about worldly wisdom and wisdom which comes from above. It sort of kind of brackets this part of the letter as an inclusio. James asks, who is wise and understanding among you? So now he pivots and he's interrogating his listeners, his readers. And he says, by his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. So now notice what James has done. He's taken the concept of wisdom and he's connected it to this idea of faith that works. So if you're wise, if you have wisdom, you need to produce works. But then he says, if you're jealous, have selfish ambition, this is not the wisdom that comes from above, but it is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. In chapter 4, James now presents two, basically what I think are orientations toward the world. Chapter 3, verse 13, he says, who is wise among you? Chapter 4, verse 1, he says, what causes quarrels among you? And so James depicts two ways to live. You can be covetous and quarrel and want more and more, or you can humble yourself under the mighty hand of God and receive the grace that comes from him. So you can live clamoring, always wanting and never really having, or you can live humbly and with contentment and depending on the grace of God, and God graciously gives to the humble. Then he closes this section with just a rapid fire set of imperatives, commands. Number 1, he says, submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, draw near to God, cleanse your hands, purify your hearts, be wretched, mourn and weep, humble yourselves before the Lord. So James and now he actually moves specifically to thinking about the last days. He says, we're living in the last days, and he really gives 3 options for how you can live in the last days. 2 of them are negative, and 1 of them is positive. The 2 negative ones are a word to the presumptuous and a word to the wicked rich. And he starts both of these sections with this call. Come now, he says. And he says, come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town, spend a year there and trade and make a profit. And he's talking about these people who presume on tomorrow. And this is the passage where he says, you should say, if God wills, we will do these things. So you have people who their orientation to the future is they're planning and they're trying to strategize how they're going to get rich. And they're presuming that they're just going to have infinite time. And then you've got a second group, and James says, come now, you who are rich. And this is where James' letter kind of takes its most biting and most critical turn. And it seems that James is actually talking to unbelievers here, because he's talking about the judgment they're going to receive. And he says they've actually murdered the righteous man. And he says they've laid up treasure in the last days. There's a lot of connections here when James talks about their moths have eaten their clothes and their treasures corroded. Reminds us again of Jesus' words where he teaches on wealth. And there's actually a Jewish writing called Sirach, and he actually talks about kind of the oppression of the poor. He talks about the fact that whoever takes away the wages of their employee is shedding their blood. So this concept was embedded in the Jewish world, in their thinking, that there's definitely a connection between defrauding someone of their wages and taking away life and imperiling their life. And then he gives the third example, the way that we should live in the world. Verse 7, and he says, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord." So rather than lay up riches or presume on the future, God's people should be patient, waiting on the coming of the Lord. And then he tells them to continue to endure, and he addresses sins of speech yet again, particularly grumbling and oaths. And it's at this point that he uses Job as an example of endurance. And so the fact that he mentions grumbling and swearing oaths, that actually could call to mind the temptation that Job had when his wife told him to curse God and die. It could be that James is basically saying, as you go through these trials, depend on God and don't sin with your mouth, don't sin with your speech. James closes, and this letter has been very much a letter of rebuke, harshly worded at some points, but he closes with words of comfort. And he addresses four situations: the suffering, the cheerful, the sick, and the sinning. And he says, if anyone is suffering, let him pray. If anyone's cheerful, let him sing praise. And then he says, if anyone among you is sick, let him call for the elders of the church. Then he goes on from there and he says, if any among you sins or wanders from the truth, he recommends that the other brothers go and restore this person. So you have this comfort and counsel. So if you find yourself suffering, there's counsel and comfort for you. If you find yourself sick, there's healing for you. If you find yourself wandering from the truth, or you know someone that's in sin, there's forgiveness available for them. And so in James' word to the sick and the sinning, he says, let this person who's sick, let them call for the elders of the church. And this could reflect an early ecclesiology where you have elders leading the church, pastor elders. But this sick person is to call. The elders are to come to them and anoint them with oil, which we see that actually happening in the Gospel of Mark when Jesus sends the disciples out to anoint the sick and to preach the gospel. But we're told that it's actually the prayer of faith which is effectual for healing. He provides Elijah as an example for prayer. He's just provided Job as an example of endurance. And now Elijah is presented as an example of, and he says, Elijah is a man just like you, and God used him mightily in prayer, and God can use you mightily in prayer. And then he goes on and addresses restoring those who sin. And he says, if you restore those who sin, you bring them back to the truth, you've saved their soul from death, and you've covered a multitude of sins. So that's the letter of James. James' counsel is just as important for us today as it was for his hearers back then. And let us seek to live out our faith and truly be wise servants of the Lord.